Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. I'm delighted to be back here at the Norwegian Academy of Music to give a lecture today and a master course tomorrow. I begin today with a lecture on musical postmodernism, and the topic is only simple at the first glance. In fact, there's a great deal of confusion about what postmodernism actually is in art music. Modernism, avant-garde, and postmodernism are simultaneously epoch terms and structural terms. Such large-scale historical categories become particularly interesting in times of fundamental transitions, when genuinely new works and artists' movements emerge, or when the discourse on the art is changing. And this is definitely the case today. The current politicization of the arts clearly indicates that we no longer live in the age of postmodernism. Strong moral and political judgments are a poor match for postmodern irony and the postmodern slogan, anything goes. So, if postmodernism is coming to an end, then it is all the more important to have a clear understanding of that dominating art epoch of the last half century. What are we losing with postmodern art, and what new options are opening up today? So let's start with the question, what is understood by the term postmodernism in art music today? In the Lexikon Neue Musik, or the Lexicon New Music, published in 2016, there is an extensive entry postmodernism written by the editor of the lexicon, Jørn-Peter Hickel. In the first line, this is a reconstruction of what various authors, especially in the German-speaking new music discourse, understand by postmodernism. It is, in other words, the quintessence of the current self-understanding of the new music scene on musical postmodernism. Following Lyothards' idea of postmodernism, the author defines musical postmodernism as a continuation and extension of modernism. Quote, postmodernism is rather the extension of various tendencies already inherent in modernity, whereas a strict negation of modernity is to be seen rather as the expression of anti-modernity. And as an application of this postmodernism concept elsewhere in the article, it says, quote, it would have proved plausible to describe as anti-modern some compositional approaches that used to be called mostly postmodern, but which rather stand for a radical negation of modernity. You see, on the one hand, musical postmodernism in new music is understood as extended modernism. On the other hand, musical postmodernism, which sees itself as a radical counterposition to modernism, is classified as an anti-modern movement. In this sense, the minimal music of Philip Glass appears to be anti-modern, an anti-modern manifestation of art music. The distinction between an extended modern and an anti-modern postmodernism is ultimately a normative distinction between good and bad postmodern music. In this, one can hear an echo from Adorno's philosophy of music, which describes Schoenberg's music as a true new music in contrast to Stravinsky. In principle, this kind of language policy fulfills the function of excluding non-avant-garde music from the sphere of new music. Anti-modern music does not have to be played at new music festivals, and it has not been taught at music academies. The description of musical postmodernism as extended modernism fits the canonical examples such as Luciano Berio's Sinfonia Alfred Schnittke's First Symphony, Wolfgang Rihm's Third String Quartet, and Louis Andriessen's Die Stijl. All this brings me to my initial thesis. Compared to postmodernism in all other arts, only a deficient form of postmodernism has developed in new music. New music has a delayed history compared to the visual arts, where postmodernism already full enfolded in the 20th centuries. Moreover, the visual arts and literature have developed a very different concept of postmodernism than new music, and have also produced a very different canon of postmodern artwork. In this respect, my first question is, what idea of postmodernism has developed in the other arts? Here, three authors have become particularly influential. The first author is literary scholar Leslie Fiedler, whose essay Cross the Border, Close the Gap introduced the term postmodernism as early as 1969. Quote, "Postmodernism closes the gap between critic and audience, even if the critic is understood to be the leader in matters of taste and the audience is understood to be his followers. More importantly, postmodernism closes the gap between artist and audience, or, in any case, between professionalism and amateurism in the fields of art." In principle, this is a transfer of ideas from Andy Warhol's and Roy Lichtenstein's pop art into literature. Fiedler shows that there is also a literary pop art. He speaks in this context of pop forms or popular art forms, and understands by this the genres of Western, thriller, science fiction, comics, and last but not least, pornography. Fiedler's definition of postmodernism is: postmodern art crosses the border to popular culture and closes the gap between entertainment and serious art. Accordingly, postmodern literature includes popular text forms in serious genres such as the novel. The essay was published in this issue of the men's magazine Playboy, which was a great performative act. Just as Fiedler's sophisticated text demands, it crosses the line between popular culture and high culture by appearing in this very popular magazine. As a necessary criterion for postmodern art, we can thus state postmodern art is popular. The second influential author in understanding postmodern art is Umberto Eco. In 1984, Eco published the emblematic postmodern novel The Name of the Rose, in which he worked with the stylistic devices of popular literary genres such as the historical novel and the detective story. In a corresponding postscript, however, he emphasizes another aspect than Fiedler. Quote, "I think of the postmodern attitude as that of a man who loves a very cultivated woman and knows that he cannot say to her, 'I love you madly,' because he knows that she knows that these words have already been written by Barbara Cartland. Still, there is a solution. He can say, 'As Barbara Cartland would put it, I love you madly.' At this point, having avoided false innocence, having said clearly that it is no longer possible to speak innocently, he will nevertheless have said what he wanted to say to the woman, that he loves her in an age of lost innocence. If the woman goes along with this, she will have received a declaration of love all the same. Neither of the two speakers will be innocent. Both will have accepted the challenge of the past, of the already said, which cannot be eliminated. Both will consciously and with pleasure play the game of irony." Eco brings a new and essential element to the concept of postmodernism. It is not enough for postmodern art and literature to enter the field of popular culture. One also needs a means of distancing oneself from popular culture. Otherwise, nobody can distinguish postmodern art from popular culture or popular art. One would appear naive in the eyes of the educated public and critics. This self-distancing device is irony, which gives every statement and every artistic form a second meaning or an afterthought. Postmodern art is thus not only popular but also ironic. The third author who has significantly shaped our understanding of postmodern art is architectural theorist Charles Yangs. In his 1977 book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, he explains that postmodern architecture is double-coded. Quote, "A postmodern building, to give a brief definition, appeals simultaneously to at least two groups of people, architects and a dedicated minority concerned with specific architectural problems, and the general public or local residents concerned with issues of comfort, traditional building methods, and their way of life. Thus, postmodern architecture appears ambiguous. This discontinuity of taste culture generates both the theoretical basis and the double coding of postmodernism. The most characteristic postmodern buildings clearly show a duality, a conscious schizophrenia. Double coding thus means that two autonomous languages of art are simultaneously present in the same postmodern work. Double coding is an independent criterion of postmodernism and adds a sociological component to the previous definition of popularity and irony. One can see this point by questioning the postmodern self-understanding that postmodern art would be democratic and open, which it is not. There is now as ever a significant asymmetry between the ordinary public and the experts. Only the experts can perceive postmodern art in its two dimensions and in its ambivalence. The laymen and amateurs, on the contrary, view the works only one-dimensionally. They neither notice nor understand the postmodern irony with its references to art history and art theory. Postmodern art does not simply close the gap between high culture and popular culture, as Fiedler said, but digs this divide anew, just on a different place. Postmodern art remains elitist, even if it plays with popular art forms, and thus retains its discriminatory power to communicate subtle social differences in society, as Berio said. Those who collect postmodern art do so not least because most others cannot decode the irony Umberto Eco describes. Three criteria can thus recognize postmodern art. Postmodern art is popular, postmodern art is ironic, and it is double-coded. All three authors each formulate a distinguishing characteristic, but thus express only a necessary condition for postmodern art. However, my thesis is that these three characteristics altogether define not only a necessary but also a sufficient criterion for aesthetic postmodernism, that is, for the idea of postmodernism prevalent in literature and in the visual arts. By a sufficient criterion, I mean that one needs precisely these three and not 2 or 4 such criteria to be able to describe the phenomenon of postmodern art completely. Furthermore, these 3 determinants are irreducible and complementary aspects. If all 3 components are equally present in an artwork, it is indeed postmodern art. On the other hand, if a work of art is only popular or only ironic, then it is, at best, a deficient form of aesthetic postmodernism. Another point concerns the inner connection of these 3 elements of postmodernism, because they build on each other. Popularity is the basic definition. However, if the gap between popular and expert culture is entirely closed, it is impossible to distinguish postmodern art from popular art. So the gap has to be closed in a specific way, namely in the mode of irony. But even both aspects taken together do not form a sufficient postmodern criterion. The ironic use of popular culture can also be found in TV series, comedy clubs, or on YouTube. Only the third aspect of double coding transforms the traits of popularity and irony into genuine postmodern characteristics. This transformation is kind of a dialectical transformation in the Hegelian sense. It clarifies that the postmodern inclusion of popular culture is the complete opposite of what it claims to be. It is not a simple turn to popular culture, but a highly elitist use of popular culture. And even the postmodern irony is no everyday humor, but an irony of the experts, which quickly turn into cynicism at the Vanity Fair. So my proposal is not simply to describe postmodernism using the 3 characteristics of the popular, irony, and double coding, but also to bring this tripartite notion of postmodernity into the form of a theory. And as a theory, it should also be able to grasp and comprehend the most canonical works of postmodern art. So let's have a brief look at some of these famous postmodern examples. A prime example of postmodern architecture is Charles Muir's Piazza d'Italia. You have already seen it on the book cover of Charles Yang's The Language of Postmodern Architecture. The Italian community of New Orleans has commissioned this piazza near the American-Italian cultural center of the city. Now let's test the tripartite postmodernism term. First, the architecture is of course popular. At least the Italian community can immediately understand the references due to Italian Roman architecture. Secondly, the piazza also has an ironic element, as there are no actual buildings surrounding the square, but only facades. Moore has not simply recreated Roman architecture, but quoted it by erecting a Roman architectural backdrop. The colorful painting of the columns and arches reinforce this impression, as it reminds one of the sceneries of a theater. But the architecture is also ironic in a straightforward sense. The 2 gargoyles you see here show the face of the architect. And third, Moore's Italian square is also double-coded. Just as there was a taboo on melody and motive in new music, there was a taboo on facades and ornaments in architecture. The postmodern architecture breaks this taboo, and that is precisely what you experience when you look at this square from a distance. In the background rises the modern faceless architecture of internal modernism, and in the foreground is a building made only of facades. The Italian community sees an Italian square, and the architectural experts recognize a revolutionary contribution to the architectural discourse. Jeff Koons is undoubtedly the epitome of the postmodern artist. He has left out no option to include the products of popular culture in high culture with a loud scandal. And this also concerns the pornographic subjects Leslie Fiedler spoke of, as you can see in Koons' Made in Heaven series from the 1990s. Let's do another test of our tripartite concept of postmodernism. For this purpose, let's take not the most provocative but the best works of Koons, among which I think Balloon Dog in Magenta is one. Here you can see a photo of the work from the 2008-2009 exhibition at the Palace of Versailles. The bronze sculpture is popular since its subject is a child toy, a dog made out of a balloon. The work also possesses an ironic moment because it stages a difference between being and appearance, just like Charles Moore's architectural backdrop. The children's toy is initially only a few centimeters tall. Now it appears magnified 100 times. The Koons sculpture is almost 3 meters high. A balloon weighs almost nothing. The steel sculpture weighs several tons. The balloon costs a few cents, but the artwork fetches between $10 and $20 million on the art market. The third aspect is double coding. On the one hand, lay people, together with their children, see a popular poodle motif. But on the other hand, the experts recognize in the balloon dog a strong statement in the art discourse, insofar as an object from popular culture is elevated into art. Koons reinforces this effect of the double coding on both sides. He stylizes the popular motif into kitsch through the coloring. Magenta is a kitsch color, and through the high gloss surface. The second enhancement concerns the additional emphasis on the high culture context. But the public does not simply see the artwork in a gallery, but in the Palace of Versailles. The exhibition context has a symbolic meaning. The castles of nobles and kings were the place of origin of high culture. Koons has also created a self-reflexive postmodern artwork, ushering in banality. The work is designed by Franz Wiesner, an unknown South Tyrolean wood sculptor, who has carved the sculpture on commission from Koons. In principle, postmodernism becomes a symbol here. One sees quite directly how the kitsch of popular culture is pushed into the art system. But this is done with an ironic hyper-affirmation and a corresponding double coding, of course. Our proposal to understand postmodern art via the three determinants of popularity, irony, and double coding can thus also be substantiated by canonical postmodern artwork. However, this tripartite term of aesthetic postmodernism is obviously at odds with Lyothards' philosophical term of postmodernism, which has been used as a guide in new music. Lyotard, by the way, has seen this contradiction himself and describes postmodernism as a revision of modernism. Quote, "The revision of modernism meant here obviously has nothing to do with what is called postmodernity or postmodernism in the market of ideologies of today. Let's make it clear, it has nothing to do with the use of parodies and quotations of modernism or modernism in buildings, plays or paintings, and even less to do with the movement in literature that resorts to the most traditional narrative forms and content. As you notice, Lyotard refers here precisely to those postmodernism definitions of Fiedler, Echo, and Jang's we have discussed in the beginning. By postmodernism, Lyotard meant primarily the end of grand narratives, which goes hand in hand with the formation of the post-industrial society. So what was the reason for Lyotard's philosophical concept of postmodernism to become prominent in new music rather than the much more art-savvy ideas on postmodernism by Fiedler, Echo, and Jang's? I think Lyotard's concept of postmodernism suited new music so well precisely because art music was not able to develop genuine musical postmodernism. The canonical postmodern compositions were, first of all, a negation of new music taboos. This rejection was also justified by the end of another grand narrative, namely the narrative of material progress. Until the 1970s, newness in new music was created by developing new aesthetic material, which had been accomplished primarily through the invention of new compositional techniques and new playing techniques. As in the visual arts, this mode of innovation has been exhausted in art music, and with it, this meta-narrative of material progress, which in Germany was established primarily by Adorno's writings. Our initial thesis was that new music has developed only a deficient postmodernism measured against the visual arts and literature. Our tripartite term of aesthetic postmodernism provides us with a tool to make such a cross-genre comparison. It would thus be necessary to show, based on some canonical postmodern compositions, that these musical works each exhibit only one or two of these three postmodern determinations. And so I will look at these four prime examples of postmodern art music in the following. Let's start with Luciano Berio's Sinfonia for orchestra and 8 electronically amplified voices, where the third movement is particularly revealing for our argument. Berio takes the basic musical structure from the third movement of Mahler's Second Symphony, interspersing quotations from music history such as Brahms, Hindemith, Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Webern, and many more. The quotations were chosen to bear a melodic and rhythmic resemblance to Mahler's Scherzo. And because of this kinship, those musical quotations can also be woven into an organic musical whole that seems related to Mahler's third movement. The quotations merge with their basic musical structure, which is itself only a quotation.
Daphnis close, written in red, counting the seconds while nothing has happened but the obsession with.
This wonderfully light and upbeat music evokes an entirely different aesthetic experience than Charles Moore's Italian Square and Jeff Koons Balloon Duck, I think. Why is this so? This is where a tripartite postmodernist term begins to work. The music clearly has a witty, ironic character, especially since it is based on the scherzo of Mahler's Second Symphony. However, one hears quotations and allusions from classical and new music, but not from popular music. The piece also belongs to high culture art on the textual level. Berio uses text from Samuel Beckett and James Joyce, which defy common understanding and are fragmented in addition. The piece also lacks any postmodern double coding. At best, Berio's Symphonia closes the gap between new music experts and classical music enthusiasts. Alfred Schnittke developed the so-called polystylism in the late 1960s, which is also understood as a specifically postmodern feature in new music. For Schnittke, polystylism is a way of making audible the world in all its many voices. I will play now the beginning of the second movement of Alfred Schnittke's First Symphony. Here you can hear a succession and blending of very different musical styles, specifically Baroque music, march music, and salon music, which later merges with idioms of new music and jazz. Again, our test question would be, is Schnittke's polystylism really an epitome of postmodern music? In direct comparison with the canonical works of postmodern art, we can immediately say it is not. Schnittke's First Symphony does open up to popular musical forms, such as the march and jazz, but it remains an opening for the educated musical audience. Schnittke's polystylism is, in fact, extended modernism, as it has been called in the lexicon of new music. Popular musical styles are used as extended musical material and transformed into a subtle form of art music in the compositional process. However, from the perspective of postmodern art, we are dealing here with only a deficient or half-hearted postmodernism. Postmodern music has always been a reaction to the taboos of the avant-garde, especially about tonality. Wolfgang Rihm made a name for himself in the 1970s by deliberately reintegrating tonal passages into his work. Rihm was primarily concerned with recovering the subjective expressiveness that had been lost with the abandonment of tonality in new music. The second movement of his third string quartet is entitled Im Innersten, or At Heart, which programmatically indicates what the composer was concerned with, the rehabilitation of the romantic idea that music can express the innermost of the subject. Rihm's string quartet is also not popular music. It too reaches, at the most, a classical audience that has little sympathy for the atonal avant-garde. And the piece lacks any ironic distance since it is all about the regaining emphatic feeling of the subject. My last example is Louis Andriessen's composition Die Stijl for 4 female voices, a female speaker and large ensemble. I will particularly refer to the third part entitled De Materie. This so-called post-minimalist piece reaches a much wider audience than the previous examples by Berio, Schnittke and Rihm. With its dividing beat and clear harmonies, the music is immediately attractive to many listeners with an affinity for rock music and jazz. However, the composition remains uncompromisingly elitist on the textual level. Andriessen has based the work on an utterly irony-free text about the life and aesthetics of Piet Mondrian. And he also uses the difficult-to-understand writings of a mathematician. Thus, the 4 female voices sing at the beginning, quote, "The line of a perfect circle is not perfection of the first order. The line of a perfect circle is perfect as a line, but it is not perfect without limitations. It is not perfect as an unending line. It is not perfection of the first order. It is not the perfect line." Thematically, Louis Andriessen's composition is anchored in classical modernism and not in postmodernism. You are now listening to the beginning of Die Materie. In the last few minutes, I wanted to show you that the canonical works of musical postmodernism are deficient and half-hearted compared to the canonical works of postmodern art. Undoubtedly, each of these four works is a great composition that rightfully has its place in music history. However, the popular material used by Berio, Schnittke, Rihm and Andriessen is comparably harmless, for it's precisely not kitsch, pornography or advertising. At best, the four postmodern composers have crossed the border between new music and classical music. But this is not the way to close the gap between the listeners of art music and popular music. Meanwhile, a prime example of musical postmodernism has been performed, namely Moritz Eggert's orchestral piece Muzak. Here you can see a photo of the premiere at the Munich Biennale in 2016 with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. Muzak is a giant collage of popular music that actually is comparable to Jeff Koons' Balloon Dog and to Charles Moore's Italian Square. We hear a large potpourri of popular music styles and can recognize style imitations of Louis Armstrong, Louis Reed, Tom Waits, David Bowie, John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Udo Jürgens and Heino, for example. But in Muzak, Eggert not only composes excessively with popular music styles, but he has also written the libretto himself, which in the most cases imitates the sentimental song lyric of pop music. The whole performance is compelling because the composer stands on stage, as you can see here, like a pop star and enthusiastically sings these songs himself. I will now play you a few clips from this 40-minute performance.
And now I see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you, and you can really see me. And now I can really see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you, and you can really see me. And now I see you, and you can really see me. And now I can really see you, and you can really see me. And now I can see you. And you can really see me, and now I see. Just one more time, baby, 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 baby. Just one more time, baby, 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 baby. Just one more time. Hey, all the people all around the city, Saturday night is a-coming and the kids are all right. And the kids are all right. Hey everybody, listen to the music. Saturday night is a-coming and the kids are all right. And the kids are all right. Oh baby, I can't stop loving you. Baby, I can't stop loving you. Will you smile when I tell you?
Muzak is a true example of musical postmodernism, in my opinion, insofar as it fulfills all three postmodern determinations at once. The piece is popular because it consists of pop music with love song poetry. The piece is ironic because it is hilarious to see a new music composer standing on stage and singing one pop song after another at the top of his lungs. And Moritz Eggert is professor for composition in Munich, in the Music Academy. And Muzak is also double-coded. On the one hand, the Bavarian Symphony Orchestra revels in musical kitsch for 3/4 of an hour. On the other hand, the whole piece is addressed to the new music scene as a provocative inclusion of postmodernism in art music. Moritz Eggert Muzak is, strictly speaking, a case of retarded postmodernism. Proper postmodernism could only evolve in new music with a delay of half a century, compared to the visual arts. The question is, of course, why has this asynchronous evolution between the visual arts and art and music emerged at all? And why did this catch-up effect occur just in the last few years and not a decade earlier or a decade later? The delayed history of art music is essentially due to its strong institutionalization. In the 20th century, strong institutions such as orchestras, music academies, radio stations, and music publishers were needed so that written scores with acoustic instruments could be performed. Although new music emancipated itself from classical music by abandoning the tonal system, it nevertheless developed within classical music institutions and adopted them. In doing so, however, it also took over classical music's guiding idea that art music is purely instrumental music by its very nature. As a result, a power dispositive emerges, in the sense of Foucault, between the music institutions and this normative guiding idea. New music institutions make it possible to perform pure instrumental music, and the idea of absolute music legitimizes institutions to prefer precisely this kind of music. This dispositive has blocked the new music evolution, I would say. In the 20th century, the institution of new music were thus able to define strict rules of inclusion and exclusion as to what counts as art music and what does not, by providing resources or not providing resources to composer. That is the most important aspect, because the institutions work like a passive filter. And this new music dispositive led to art music operating in the mode of classical modernism throughout the 20th century. New music followed the traditional idea of pure instrumental music and stretched the idea of material progress to the extreme. At the same time, new music institutions marginalized or blocked developments such as the formation of conceptual music and postmodern music. The reason for this conservatism was simple. The performance apparatus has no interest in musical forms that, like conceptual music, dispense with and make fun of musicians, ensembles, music academies, concert halls, and music publishers. And neither did these institutions have any motivation to work with inferior popular music forms. For musicians trained for technical difficulty and top performances, popular music is simply an artistic underachievement. You don't need the classical music institutions for that purpose, but rather you need a band with an electric guitar and with drums. The situation changed only with the digital revolution, which led to a deinstitutionalization of new music. It became easy to integrate concepts, videos, texts, popular music into one's own composition and to perform this impure music. Popular music invaded the work of digital natives at the computer interface, as if by itself. As a result, there has also been a change of attitude in art music, so that even pieces like Moritz Eggert Muzak could be performed at a new music festival with a large symphony orchestra. That was impossible 20 years ago, I think. However, Eggert's pop music collage does not herald a new age of postmodernism, because it is, after all, a case of catching up on history. Besides such highly symbolic works, one can write only once. In fact, the delayed history of art music has been fast-tracked through digitization. Digital conceptual music, relational music, music postmodernism, and Gehalt aesthetic music all developed simultaneously in the last few years. This rapid-fire development also has consequences for musical postmodernism, which is already coming to an end, barely having full formed. On the one hand, digitization makes musical postmodernism possible. On the other hand, it is immediately absorbed by this very technological development. The moment anyone and everyone can compose on the computer with samples from all musical epochs and styles, postmodern compositional strategies lose all significance. It becomes almost impossible to quote, ironize, or double code anything in a sample music culture. Each quotation becomes, in principle, one sample among many, and is immediately transformed into a freely available material of musical expression. And here inevitably arises the question of what this expression stands for. The released musical material becomes, in other words, a means by which one can articulate a certain aesthetic content, or I use the German word Gehalt. Gehalt is a content which is created by an interpretation. This rushed and hurried history leads to a sense of loss in new music. Trond Reinholdtsen's piano concerto Theory of the Subject, which premiered at the Ultima Festival 2016 here in Oslo, is a brilliant testimony to this. The pianist is replaced in part by a self-playing piano on stage, though the concerto is about the pianist's search for purpose and meaning. In the run-up to the premiere, she also went to the composer's studio, where three strange creatures with construction foam heads live. These Norwegian trolls, I call them trolls, sing a postmodern aria with the beautiful text. Here we are sitting in the postmodern marsh, to give the pianist some new ideas. The scene projected above the orchestra during the piano concerto begins with this image. It represents not only the Norwegian letter Ö, at the same time it is a mathematical sign for an empty set. In the piano concerto, Ö functions as a symbol of a new beginning at a 0 point. This hyper-philosophical song is an absolute favorite of mine, so I incorporate a video clip into every lecture whenever there's an opportunity, and here it is. So, in my opinion, Reinholdtsen finds a way out of the postmodern march in this piano concerto. He condenses the contexts of meaning to such an extent that the piano concerto in itself achieves the paradigm shift from material aesthetics to Gehalt aesthetics. But this Gehalt aesthetic turn is already another topic. I want to discuss it with you tomorrow at the masterclass based on the text Reflexive Notion of Music. And that's all for today, and thank you very much.